name is Jennifer Ibrahim, and I am the Associate Director of the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation's National Program Office for Public Health Law Research. The purpose of this presentation, Building a Public Health Law Research Proposal Using the Scientific Method, is intended to provide potential grant applicants and public health law researchers more generally an overview of how to use the scientific method to build a methodologically sound research proposal.
The scientific method defines specific steps in temporal order to develop a methodologically sound research project. In the next slides, I'll go into greater detail about each of the steps. The first step is to develop the research questions and then conduct background research. Once you're clear on the details and debate surrounding a particular topic, it's necessary to develop study hypotheses based on a theoretical model. With the hypotheses in place, the next step is to clearly define the research design and select measures. Once all of the planning is complete, you can begin to collect the data and analyze the data. Lastly, it's imperative to communicate the findings of your study, which quite often spark new research questions, and the process begins again. Now we'll go through each phase. The first step in developing a research proposal is to consider the research questions that will serve as the foundation of the project. At this point, you should already have an area of public health law research in mind, such as areas that need further study or areas where there's debate or controversy. Now, it's important to think about specific research questions that can be investigated. In addition to investigating new areas of public health law research, there are also important questions that relate to existing studies. So, is there sufficient research to create an evidence base on the topic, or are there contradictions or gaps in the research that need to be considered? You should also look to policymakers and practitioners to define the research questions. This will help to ensure the relevance of the results. Research questions should focus on a specific aspect of the topic of interest and be answerable through systematic data collection and analysis. While there may be a series of unanswered questions on the topic of interest, a good research study will select clearly defined and focused research questions to guide the study. A study with too many research questions can become unruly and ultimately accomplish nothing. A study with poorly defined research questions also goes unfunded because the reviewers see that the investigators have not taken the time to think through the topic and carve out specific areas. Prior to even thinking about developing a research proposal on a particular topic, it's necessary to be well versed in the subject area and where it fits in the larger body of literature. Innovative research studies are always welcome, but they must be grounded in the existing evidence, so be sure to describe how the proposed research goes beyond what has been done before. It's also feasible to think about your prospective research questions in the context of other disciplines to see what lessons can be transferable. While most of you already have a good sense of your area of expertise, it's nonetheless important to revisit the literature to clearly articulate the current debate on the issue and how your proposed study will advance the field of public health law, research, policy, and/or practice. One excellent way to become aware of the current knowledge of the topic is to reach out to policymakers and practitioners. Similar to what was mentioned in the previous slide, talk with these groups to help you define the research questions and understand the context and parameters of the issue. Beyond just speaking with interested parties as you develop your research questions, it's important to engage your audience. Be sure that you know who's interested in the topic from both a research perspective and a policy perspective. It's equally important to know the individuals, groups, or organizations that are involved in the issue, as well as the individuals or groups that will actually use your findings, such as policymakers, legal and public health practitioners, advocates, and of course the general public. Both sets of audiences can help you to craft meaningful and relevant questions. By taking the time to develop these relationships, it will help you to refine your study questions as needed and save you time when you're ready to disseminate your findings. Rather than trying to get your message out, if these parties know that you will have results ready at a certain time, they may come to you to get the answers when the study is complete, and perhaps once you've defined the specific research questions, it's time to design the study. The best way to communicate a clear proposal which flows from the research questions through design and measurements is to have a theory to guide the study. A theory is a structure designed to explain a set of empirical observations and the mechanisms or relationships between those observations. Without a theory, proposals quite often look like a fishing expedition where there may be great research questions but no logic to guide the selection of measures and the analysis plan. In selecting a theoretical model, we encourage you to explore legal, socio-legal, regulatory, economic, and behavioral theories, just to name a few. Using an interdisciplinary approach adds to the innovation of the study while providing a clear framework to design the study and select measures. A theory is a very broad explanation of the relationship between factors, so it's important that you apply the theory to your specific research topic. Use the theory to help you write testable hypotheses. For example, as we show here, if the theory says that the decision to engage in a protective behavior is a result of perceived threat and perceived benefit, then a seatbelt law could influence the perceived threat of being fined for not wearing a seatbelt, which, coupled with the perceived benefit of being restrained by the seatbelt, could result in increased use of seatbelts. In addition to stating the hypotheses, a clear statement of the specific aims are needed. What is it that you'll actually be doing? You've completed your background work and determined the theory that will guide the development of your hypotheses, and now you'll succinctly describe your game plan. This is the opportunity to tell your readers what it is you're going to be testing in the study. Specific aims should ideally be no more than 3 bullets. Keep in mind that this is not the place to justify your study or explain significance, but rather just state what you're going to do. It's often quite helpful to draft this section of the proposal first, as it's a way to build the remainder of the proposal. One example of a specific aim could be, as shown here, to test the hypothesis that seatbelt laws increase the likelihood of seatbelt use by increasing the perceived threat of being fined as measured by X and the perceived benefit of being protected by the seatbelt as measured. One tool which can be helpful in working through the theory section of your proposal is a logic model. A logic model is a visual illustration of what you believe to be the nature of the relationship between the dependent and independent variables. So for example, here we use the research question which asks, do hands-free laws reduce the likelihood of car crash injuries and fatalities? The logic model demonstrates the hypothesized relationship that hands-free laws will result in increased public awareness and enforcement, which will increase the perceived threat of being caught by violators, which can increase driver compliance with the hands-free law, which can ultimately reduce crashes, injuries, and fatalities. Each step of the logic model defines the mechanism by which the law can affect health outcomes and the construct to be measured. The next step is to define the way in which you'll conduct the study, including how you'll measure each of the constructs. With the content expertise and a set of testable hypotheses in hand, it's time to weigh the merits of the different types of study designs. Does the research question call for a qualitative or a quantitative approach? Is it possible to do an experimental study, or is a quasi-experimental design warranted? Despite the heavy emphasis on experimental study designs, such as randomized clinical control trials, a well-designed quasi-experimental study can produce equally sound results. There are other circumstances when qualitative methods, such as observational or mapping studies, are most appropriate. Or you may use a combination of quantitative and qualitative methods. It's important to be both rigorous and innovative in your approach, and be sure that the design selected is the best way to answer your research questions. The specific aims of the study and research questions should help to guide the study design outlines the process by which you'll conduct the research. The components that you should include largely depend on the nature of the study itself. For quantitative studies, you should include the population to be studied, the sampling plan, the power analysis, definition of the dependent and independent variables, covariates, and potential confounding factors. We'll talk about measures more in just a minute. For qualitative research, such as ethnography, phenomenology, and case studies, you should identify the approach and describe the process to recruit participants, as well as defining your independent and dependent variables and questions to be pursued with your participants. The study design should be a blueprint to conduct the study, so that anyone who reads the study design section could replicate the project. The next step is to select and/or define the measures used to assess each of the constructs in your logic model. In some circumstances, there are existing measures or validated instruments that can be used, or there are other times when new measures have to be created. When developing new measures, it's important to test for validity to ensure that the measure is a good reflection of the construct of interest. When collecting the data, you should develop a protocol that documents how the data will be collected. Again, you can think of this as a blueprint so that other researchers can replicate the process that you used. For primary data collection, describe the process by which the data will be collected, including considerations like intercoder reliability. Will the data be double data entered to eliminate human error in recording? For secondary data, discuss the merits of the data set and how the data was actually collected. Most validated publicly available data sets will have a narrative to describe the data collection process. It's important to note that primary data collection is not necessary. There are lots of health databases that can be potentially used to answer questions about law, which is a good reason to team up with experienced health researchers. I'll say more about assembling your research team in just a minute, but it's good to keep in mind the time and cost associated with primary data collection. A strong research proposal may look at an existing health outcomes dataset in the context of a law using an innovative methodological approach, or just using a perspective of the law that's never been considered before. Even a study with outstanding research questions and a sound theoretical basis can meet flaws in the form of threats to internal and external validity and reliability. A research study has internal validity if the outcome is a function of the variables that are measured, controlled, or manipulated in the study. So it's important to think about the variables selected and to be sure that they're a true measure of the concepts or constructs presented in your logic model. A study has external validity if the findings of the study can be generalized beyond the specific study sample. A study has reliability if there's consistency in the measurements and the study can be replicated under the same conditions with the same findings. Threats to validity and reliability can be addressed through careful design selection and/or your analysis. Reviewers will not expect every study to be without such threats, but you should demonstrate how you'll test for such threats so that these can be accounted for during the research project or at least acknowledged during dissemination of findings. Working with a statistician on your team to think through these threats to validity. Again, a well-written research plan should be a blueprint to conduct the study. It's a clear statement of how you plan to do the work. Therefore, the research questions, design, and measures should lead you to clear selections for your analysis plan. If the data is quantitative, think about the type of data being used. Is it nominal, ordinal? And think about the types of tests or comparisons that will allow you to answer your research questions. Don't overlook the basic descriptive statistics, which can often tell a story in and of themselves. For qualitative data, describe the coding system for content analysis or other methods for interpreting the information collected. In the case of mixed methods, both of the previous comments are appropriate, as well as a process for triangulation whereby the qualitative and quantitative data are linked. Again, the analysis section is another opportunity for innovation without compromising the methodological rigor of the study. Always go back and revisit the research questions and specific aims to be sure that the analysis answers. Once the analysis is complete, the study is not yet done. Just like in the first steps of this presentation, I emphasize the need to engage the audience to help define the research questions. It's important to come full circle. The final step to make the results important is to communicate the findings. Clear communication should include a synthesis of the findings, including both expected and unexpected outcomes, as well as an explanation of how the findings contribute to the evidence base. While the study findings are what they are, there are different means by which those findings can be communicated. You should tailor the findings and think about what information should be transferred to policymakers. It's equally important to think about the research process itself and what knowledge should be shared. You may communicate a different aspect of the study to policymakers such as legislators, practitioners, and advocates, as opposed to academics. Consider who you'll be communicating to which audience and how. Think about what you hope to be the effect of your findings on each audience and work towards creating a communications plan to achieve that goal. And lastly, just a few additional considerations. Beyond the specific steps that were just reviewed, I want to reiterate some important points. While it's necessary to have a sound research plan, it's equally important to have a well-qualified research team to conduct the study, which includes appropriate theoretical and methodological expertise. A mix of academics and practitioners are also highly recommended to develop and produce research findings that can be useful to policymakers and advocates. It's necessary to consider the audience that will be using the study findings. It's a consideration that should start with the first steps of developing the proposal to ensure that the right questions are being answered all the way through the dissemination of your study findings. Without effective communication throughout the life of the study, the project will have little or no impact on policy.
Thank you for reviewing this presentation. I hope that it provided some useful pointers, but this is by no means a complete guide to developing your research proposal. It merely offers an overview and some key considerations at specific points in the proposal development process. For more information on public health law research methods, please visit our website at www.publichealthlawresearch.org. And best of luck preparing your public health law research proposals.